Just because you're software and not hardware doesn't mean that you're not a medical device. I learned a lot about the regulatory environment in a very short time. You are sort of asking the impossible. You want to build something tiny and cheap that should scale all the way into the sky. In medical devices, you cannot do those things because there are rules that you must follow, and so it tends to make team members happy. I have nothing but respect for that job. Yeah, that's a very good question.
We're back with our new episode of Digital Health Interviews, and I'm really excited to introduce our today's guest. His name is Wessel Kooyman. Hi, Wessel.
Hello, Alex. Nice to
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Very good. I'm really excited about our interview. So let's start with a short intro. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a developer by background. I started out when the web was first invented, so that tells you that I'm very old. And so worked most of my career as a web developer, but I was always, I moved to Silicon Valley, to San Francisco when I was 24. And it was in the dot-com crazy time. Mm-hmm. And so we did a lot of web development, a lot of crazy things. And after a number of years, I worked with a team of developers, and we would get jobs from different clients. And they sort of always pushed me to be the one talking to the clients and deal with the billing and all that stuff. So for better or for worse, I went a bit to the side of management, the management side of development, not just the pure coding. And I just slowly worked my way over from there to more and more managing developers, writing documentation, dealing with the clients, the stakeholders, etc. I started my own software company around that, and I sold that company about 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. And since then, I've been working in the medical device, or the healthtech medical device industry, which has been really fun to do, but as a consultant.
How did you get into this industry? Just by accident?
Yeah, it was a pure coincidence. An acquaintance of mine was the CEO of a startup, and he had CTO troubles. And he already came to me years earlier. He's like, Wessel, should I hire this CTO? And I interviewed the CTO, and I said, he's a terrible candidate for you because he came from a bank, so he likes to build these gigantic, structures, and you need for a startup, that's no good. He completely ignored me, hired the guy, and then so 3 years, I think it was 3 years into the adventure, he came to me like, Wessel, it's not working. And I was like, who did you hire? Oh, that guy. Yeah, no wonder it didn't work. and then he was like, wow, what can I do to fix it? I said, well, these are the things you can do. 2 months later, he comes back to me, Wessel, it's not working with my CTO. I was like, okay, you need to fire him. And he's like, yeah, but I was like, go to the lawyers, come up with a communication plan, sit him down, and it sucks, and it's complicated with shares because he was a co-founder, but, it's got to be done. Right. And he's like, well, can you take over as CTO? I was like, sure. I was like, to be clear, I have no health tech experience. He's like, yeah, no, it's okay, you'll learn. Don't worry about it. And that's how I rolled into it. So I became the CTO. I had him hire me as interim CTO, and ended up staying there about a year. Learned a lot about the regulatory environment in a very short time. And since then, I've been doing consulting work for different startups and the occasional huge company.
Very interesting. My first question would be, since you worked a lot in web development, worked for digital agencies, how would you find, what differences can you find in developing software for digital health and medtech and just regular software development or web development?
Well, there's lots of differences, of course. So in regular development, whether it's web or mobile, doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. There are certain things you should be doing, such as testing, such as documenting. But you can get away without doing those things. And most companies do get away with it. If you once in a while break a feature on Facebook, the world's not going to end. Let's face it. If you have crappy documentation, the new developers will curse you, but you get away with it. You'll just waste the time of the new developer. In medical devices, you cannot do those things because there are rules that you must follow. Otherwise, you cannot be on the market.
Mm-hmm. How much time would it take for a developer to gain those skills in order to create a great software in Medtech?
For the developer, if you're just a guy coding, actually not that much changes for you. You'll have a little bit of development or like documentation because only you know what's going on in the code. So there's no other person that can do it. But often development teams will have like a regulatory project manager, a product owner who does a lot of the documenting. You have dedicated testers, QA engineers that do all the testing work. So it's more of a team effort than really the individual developer.
Okay. As you mentioned, you were a CTO in a few Medtech startups. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask about a few of them.
Sure.
Let's start with the Moodbird.
Right. I was only there for a short time. So they're not a medical device, actually, but they will be one day. And so they, actually, I'm a mentor in the Startup Accelerator program that they're a part of. It's called IMEC iStart. And so they came to me, it was a big accident, actually. We were working in the same office space, and they didn't have any technical expertise. They were just two founders and like two part-time employees at that point. And they said, Wessel, we need help with the development because we're working with 3 suppliers and they all, like delays and problems, etc. So I stepped in for a few months to sort of straighten out the problems. And so they have a device that's for breathing. And so right now that's not a medical device. It's more like a therapy, well-being device. But they want to transition to being a medical device at some point.
What market are they targeting?
Well-being is a gigantic market. It's unregulated, so you get to do whatever you want. And it's a sad commentary on society, but more and more people feel unhappy and want help. And go to any bookstore, and you'll see a huge section on self-help with books. Go to YouTube. And so it's a gigantic industry, and so they focused on breathing exercises. And so their device, you hold in your hand, and it actually expands and contracts, and that so the device tells you like that how to breathe. And then it also has a sensor that measures your heart rate in the thumb, and so it can also respond in real time to your heart rate.
Interesting.
Very cool device.
Very cool. I agree. What about Helpilepsy?
Helpilepsy, yeah. They're now called Neuroventis. So they have a pure software medical device. It's called Software as a Medical Device, SAMD. And they basically, in the neurological space, solve a bunch of problems related to almost more administrative, but also diagnostic. And they have a lot of web automation that seems obvious in the normal world, but in neurology, that automation never arrived. And so they're bringing that. And it sounds really common sense, but they're super focused on the problems of neurologists today.
Let's go back to ASMD, software as a medical device. How would you define this term, and what other examples can you tell us?
So any medical device that's pure software, there's no hardware component to it. So that can be a mobile app, that can be a web-based application. All of those devices are called SAMD, software as a medical device. And so they follow the same rules as any other medical device. So just because you're software and not hardware doesn't mean that you're not a medical device. No, you're still a medical device, and you still have to follow a million rules. And it's a very quickly growing space because, software is getting bigger in everything, so also in the medical universe.
Also, I want to talk about a little bit about the processes, how it works in Medtech. Unless you already said that documentation is crucial, like if we're talking about a website, you probably, a developer, can skip the documentation at some point and it's not going to be a huge problem. But in Medtech, it's so important. Can you tell us, how did you set up this process? What tools did you use to write all the documentation specifications to make sure that it's all in place, and how the process is organized in general?
Okay, sure. So there's a bunch of regulations that tell you what to do, first of all. So a lot of it is imposed on you. You don't have a choice at all. In very, 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 very short, both in the EU and the US, broadly, you have to first of all, define your requirements and decide on those, document them. Then you write your specifications using what's called design controls. You think about what you design and you have inputs and outputs and you document those. Then you think about risk. What kind of safety risks are in my device and what can I do to mitigate those? And sometimes that will be changing the software. That can be a mitigation. You have many other types of mitigations. Then after you've made all of those documents, then you start coding. And then based on that, you're going to write test cases. And based on those test cases, you're going to test your software. And then you're going to document in a report that you passed all those tests. And only then can you start thinking about releasing the software.
Okay, but would each member of the team, developer, would do his part of the documentation, or there probably should be one person who is doing the documentation?
Depends on the team sizes, of course. So a lot of that, like early requirements gathering, is usually a role like functional analyst, business analyst. Writing the specifications. This is where you really do the design of the software. This is, of course, where a role like a software architect, senior developers, etc., are involved. Because you start thinking about what components will I create and how will they work together. You also need like a role like a product owner who thinks about, from a business point of view, what do we need to build first? What's most important? How are we going to put that into a roadmap and a planning? The developer themselves, of course, they were involved in the design because it's a software that you're designing. So that's before you start writing a single line of code. You've already written a document like, how will I build this software? Then you build software. The same as always, you're building software. And then usually somebody that's not part of the software team, a QA engineer, will do the test case writing based on those requirements you've already defined, and then do the testing itself. And then, of course, the developers are responsible for fixing all the bugs.
Of course.
And you do see a big difference when you have a formal tester, you start seeing like how many bugs developers leave in. And that's what I've been a developer for a very long time, so I have nothing but respect for that job. But I think developers, as a developer, you develop a blind spot because you're so used to clicking through it, the way it's supposed to work, that you forget to click on that other button that gives you an error. And so an outside perspective for a tester is, I would say, very, very, very worthwhile. And I would recommend that to anybody not working in the medical space. Spend the time and the money to have a QA engineer, because you'll find so many bugs that your client will not end up finding.
Both manual and automated?
Yep. So most automated testing, you have unit testing, which is something the developers do themselves. You have the test analysis stuff that usually is done in Jenkins, which is a build tool for developers, and it has like a testing module, which is automated. And then there's manual testing. So then for manual testing, you have two types. You have scripted testing and what's called spontaneous testing, I think is the latest term for it, where you just click on random stuff and you see if you can break something. And both are equally important.
Okay. When a new member of the team joins the team, does this person needs to go over the whole documentation that was written before in order to be onboarded to the project?
Developer?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and actually the regulations have quite a bit to say about this. So in general, like there's a bunch of trainings you must create for your organization, and people must follow those, and you must document them.
Internal trainings.
Internal trainings, yeah.
Okay.
And the same is true for software. And they tend to be more complex software products. It's not a simple website. It's not a WordPress. It's something with many moving parts. So it actually makes sense for them to work their way through the documentation. So I would say specifications are still interesting for a developer because it talks directly about what is being built. Requirements, developers may not care about so much. It's more of the why. Why are we building something? That may not be relevant for a developer. Anything that's architecture or technical documentation, of course, it makes all the sense in the world to read that first.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about methodologies. Right now, everyone is just talking about agile approach,
of course,
agile coaches, scrum masters, and all those roles. But in medtech industry, for instance, if we take insulin pump, can you really create a startup create an insulin pump with the agile approach? Because really, patient's life basically depends on this device, and sometimes a startup founder cannot just come every sprint and change the requirements because something really important needs to be tested a million times. So is that a good place to go back to old school waterfall approach?
That's actually a really good question. People think that because the safety requirements are so high that agile is somehow dangerous. Mm-hmm. But I've seen the opposite, actually, because agile allows you to build out features one by one, mm-hmm. Okay? Which means that you're not building, waterfall is the mountain. You're building a mountain of functionality all at once, and after a year, you start testing it. Right. The nice thing about agile is that you get to test sooner. Mm-hmm. And so your insulin pump example, of course, all the safety-related things have to be built. But you don't have to build them all at once during development. You can start with the pump and then later do the sensor. You can have a perfectly functional pump, test it, not on a patient, of course, and then build the sensor that measures is the pump. I'm just using this as an example. Right. And what's nice about Agile is that you're reducing risk. So that's still true, just as true as it is outside of Medtech. And you're also making people happier, I've seen. People in big waterfall projects, tend to be on the same subject for years, and it's just really demotivating. And with Agile, you see results for your work every couple of months. And so it tends to make team members happier.
That's really good insight. On our channel, lots of other YouTube channels, we talk about regulations so much, and this is apparently your one of the biggest areas of expertise. This is probably would be a kind of dumb question, but when a startup founder decides to create a startup in medtech or digital health, should the CTO or whoever, the architect, create the architecture of the product considering all those regulations right in the beginning, or you can add them later on?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I don't think I've ever seen a startup that started out following the regulations. Okay, so already there's no examples that I can think of. Bigger organizations is a different story. Mm-hmm. So no, usually what you do is you start building your product a normal way, and then later on you add the regulatory stuff. Is that a terrible thing to do? No, because it's a money thing more than anything. Mm-hmm. If you want to follow the regulations and you're not from that universe, you need to spend money. So you have regulatory consultancies that will help you and babysit you through the entire process, mm-hmm. but they require money. And so it's often what founders end up doing is just building the product itself with the minimum amount of money and the maximum amount of their time. Usually they're hand coding themselves. And then take that MVP or whatever you want to call it to investors and say, listen, now we need 100K to be compliant with the regulations so that we can go to market. And that's, if you think about it, that's a decent strategy because investors have something to look at, which is the most important thing to them. It's not just a PowerPoint. There's an actual product there. They understand that regulatory takes money and that the co-founders probably won't have that money out of their pocket. So I find that a credible strategy.
But does that mean that in many cases, when you do raise that pre-seed or seed round, in many cases, because of that bad architecture was created in the beginning, you need to throw everything away and start from scratch? That's
not a problem unique to healthtech. I've seen that in every prototype. And if you think about it, you are sort of asking the impossible. You want to build something tiny and cheap that should scale all the way into the sky. It makes sense that unicorn code base doesn't exist. And so, painful as it is, rewriting is probably always going to be part of a startup's development story.
But again, in many cases, startups are not ready for that. Just to throw everything away they created for half of the year, and they start squeezing and do some kind of refactoring in the old code, and usually that doesn't work out well.
Yeah, and then they come to you guys to fix the mess.
True. According to your experience, what types of certifications or approvals are the most difficult to get?
For a medical device onto the market? So my experience is only with the EU, which is a regulation called the MDR, Medical Device Regulation, and in the US, the FDA's regulation. And they're both really tough, and they should be. You are putting a medical device onto the market, and that will do things with patients. And so they classify the different medical devices more or less into 3 classes and associate a risk level with that. So, for instance, Class A, you can only lightly injure somebody. Class B, you can seriously injure somebody. And Class C, you can kill somebody. So, for instance, your insulin pump would be a Class C product. And so based on that, they sort of adjust the regulatory burden to be reasonable, because they do understand that just saying no all the time is not useful either. So they try to be smart about how much they ask to whom. Having said that, you have to understand that all these regulations have been made for large companies who have been in business for many years. So for startups following those rules, the shoe is never ever going to fit. Okay? It's always going to be very painful and nonsensical at oftentimes for a startup to follow those regulations. And that's just part of the process. I mean, they would have to rewrite the regulations for startups, I guess. I mean, that would be one, but that's just, it has never happened.
Do you think it's going to happen anytime soon?
No.
No?
No, but, the regulatory consultancies make their money that way. The investors have something to invest in early on. The government, gets to have only one set of rules. It's a system that works. It's not great, but it works.
Okay. Lots of startup founders are really scared of FDA and getting the approval, but I've heard lots of opinions that actually after you get the permission in Europe, it's much easier to get FDA. Would you agree with that?
That all depends. First of all, in the EU, things are changing a lot because we went from an old set of rules to a new set of rules, the MDD, and now the MDR. And for instance, SAMDs got much more complicated in the EU. And so today, probably the reverse is true, that FDA for pure SAMD is probably easier than EU, but it's too soon to tell because the regulation is quite new and most companies are still transitioning. They're both tough. Would I say FDA is tougher? FDA, in a lot of ways, is more sensible. You can argue with them, and they have better documentation. They have a whole set of guidance documents that are super helpful. Whereas in the EU, it's a bit more rigid, and it's harder to sort of work with the regulator. And they don't have all that extra documentation. So they both have their pros and cons, I would say.
Okay. When a startup founder, for example, comes to you and asks your help to get the FDA approval, and he wants it as soon as possible, what do you think is the earliest he possibly can get that?
Well, first of all, you need more than just me, because my specialty is purely the software part of the approval, and but the picture is much bigger than that. There's a bunch of non-software things, including the hardware, but also including how you organize many aspects of bookkeeping, how you do your clinical trial, because you have to have a clinical trial. None of that is my expertise. You need to work with a traditional regulatory team for that. I mean, I've seen approvals. Honestly, I've never seen less than a year. And that's, for some products, that's fast. Yeah, that all depends on the complexity. And how well is, for instance, a clinical trial, again, not my expertise at all, but if you screw up your documentation, or if you change the parameters of the trial midway, you can invalidate your whole trial and you need to start again. So knowing beforehand exactly what you're doing is really important for that part.
Good. Well, I think it's good for startup founders to understand that you gotta wait at least for 1 year. It's like minimum. Like if you're...
Well, you gotta build it first.
Of course. But I mean, if you're dreaming that, all right, you have a product already built and I'm gonna go and tomorrow I'm gonna get FDA, don't count on that.
No, but there are other things you can do. You can not be a medical device. Is that an Apple Watch?
Yep.
It's not a medical device. Do you know why?
Why?
Because Apple wrote an instruction called the intended use. Each device has an intended use, and in it specifies that they only give advice about what you should do with a proper medical person. Mm-hmm. So they're not giving you a diagnosis, and they're not your medical device. So they're not a medical device. That's one thing you can do. Closed trials, you don't need full approval for that. So if you just have one professor that wants to do one specific experiment, mm-hmm. you could be part of that, and you don't have market approval for that. And there's other, you can go to markets that are less regulated. Mm-hmm. Is that ethical? Don't ask me, but so there are some things you can do.
Okay, that's also good to know. Since we started talking about some comparison between the United States and Europe, what differences did you notice while developing software for Medtech in the US and in Europe? It can be anything, I know, management approach, speed to market, anything. What can be different?
Many things, first of all, and that's not really specific to health tech. I mean, in general, to go down the route of all the cliches, in the US, things move faster. Mm-hmm. People tend to be more decisive, and there's usually a bit more money to throw around. So I'm currently working with 2 US startups, and it's like super. If they schedule a call, it's 15 minutes. That's all the time you're going to get. So you better make your point in those 15 minutes. Europe, it's usually an hour. And if you didn't make your point in an hour and you need to schedule another meeting of an hour next week, that's fine too. I know these are all cliches, but they really are true in a lot of ways. And the bureaucracy in the US is just as bad. That's a stereotype that's not correct. They're not more efficient in that sense. In some ways, Europe is more modern. But there's a bit more common sense on the other side. So that can be helpful at times. And more money. They simply have more money. And often they spend it foolishly. For instance, I cannot imagine why you would want to spend insane amounts of money on US developers when there's wonderful talent in the Ukraine. I honestly don't understand, because the difference in cost is like 5x or something. But they'll waste, in my opinion, waste money that way. But they get away with it because there's a lot more money sloshing around in that ecosystem.
Do you think the medtech industry in Europe is moving much slower because of that lack of money here?
That's certainly part of it, yes. Mm-hmm. In general, Europe is less startup friendly. Mm-hmm. It's just harder to be a startup. I worked many years ago with this guy who spent most of his life in startups, and this was back in Paris. And he said, who's the biggest investor in startups in France? I was like, no, what do you mean? He's like, well, it's the unemployment agency, because most founders in France live under unemployment benefits, who are very generous. And so he's like, that's the biggest investor. And I was like, yeah, you're right. That of course is a massive difference with the US, because they barely have unemployment benefits there. And so, that's part of it. I mean, does Europe produce great startups? Obviously, of course we do. But it is a different culture. Things move at different speeds. It's a fragmented market. The EU does make things better, but you still have national level approvals that can be very complex to manage as a health tech startup.
Finally, what kind of recommendations or pieces of advice could you give to startup founders in order to get their startups hopefully to the unicorn level at some point?
Well, of course, don't be discouraged. In health tech, of course, you're going to have extra hurdles. Regulatory is one of them. Clinical trials, all these different obstacles. But keep in mind that also means that you're going to have fewer competitors. So it's also easier in that sense to operate in that space. And investors are also, there's a lot of life science investors. They know those obstacles better than you. So if you come to them early with money needs, they're like, oh yeah, of course you're going to need that money. We understand. So it's a different mindset. You're not building Facebook. You're not going to code a bunch of PHP that's a big mess and then throw it on the market. That's another business model entirely. So just be aware that your market is different than the general tech market. Don't be discouraged. It's harder, but even a normal startup is hard because you have a million competitors. So do your thing, work hard, focus.
Were you thinking about creating a startup on your own someday?
Me, I love being part of other startup adventures. As a consultant to startups, I get to take a peek in the kitchen, and it is always fascinating what you find. And then I tend to move on from one client to the next, anywhere between, 3 months and a year, I would say. Mm-hmm. So for me, the big benefit is I get to see different companies, different teams solving problems differently. I get to add value because I've seen a lot, so I can usually help out. So I'm happy where I am.
Cool. Thank you for this great interview and good luck with your journey.
All right. Thank you, Alex.